Welcome back to The Explainer. Now, I want you to imagine, just for a second, the sheer mind-boggling logistical nightmare of fighting a global world war. You need astronomical amounts of materials, and frankly, you need them yesterday. But historically, this massive sudden spike in demand triggers some absolute economic disasters. We're talking runaway inflation, massive national debt, and rampant profiteering. So back in the 1930s, as the shadow of another world war was looming, American leaders faced a really heavy question. Could we actually mobilize for war without completely breaking the economy in the process? Well, at the time, military leaders and planners were incredibly optimistic. General Douglas MacArthur confidently declared that profiteering based on army contracts was outright eliminated. And influential planners like Bernard Baruch echoed this exact sentiment. They promised that the U.S. would enter the next conflict perfectly organized, completely without inflation, and with no war profit to any man. I mean, it sounded amazing, right? Like the perfect, idealized blueprint for a fair war effort. But, as you might guess, here's where the reality check comes in. In 1936, the Senate Special Committee on Investigation of the Munitions Industry released a massive report. They basically set out to rigorously audit the War Department's proposed mobilization bills to see if those idealistic claims of a profitless war could actually hold water under the brutal, chaotic pressures of reality. Let's dive right into Section 1, Planning for Future War, focusing on the War Department's Industrial Mobilization Plan. The committee found that the military's entire plan was built on a few uncompromising assumptions. First and foremost, getting materials and achieving victory are the absolute primary objects. Literally everything else, including stopping those wartime profiteers, is entirely subsidiary. The military's main goal was just to ensure procurement ran smoothly, without causing any radical shakeups to the normal, everyday economic order. The War Department laid it out plain and simple with this official conclusion. When the survival of the nation is on the line, trying to meticulously control profits naturally takes a backseat. To the military, getting the guns, ships, and rations immediately is vastly more important than trying to fix the economic structures of the country during an emergency. Which brings us to Section 2, the profit problem and the inherent conflict in wartime. So it really all boils down to this massive clash between two totally incompatible goals. On one hand, you have the desperate, immediate need to skyrocket production for victory. On the other hand, you want to regulate economic evils and limit corporate profits. The committee concluded that whenever you pit these two against each other, profit control is the one that gets sacrificed, every single time. Let's look at how this plays out in Section 3, Industry's Upper Hand, or Negotiation in a Seller's Market. In the sheer chaos of a war emergency, the government desperately has to buy, and private industry is the only one selling. The Senate report highlights that industry inevitably holds all the cards here. The government simply doesn't have the time to perfectly audit everything, so they are forced to rely heavily on the very industries they're trying to regulate to give them critical data on costs and valuations. So why does the government lose its leverage so quickly? Well, it's not just about the need for speed. The government is essentially at the mercy of industry's own accounting books. Plus, the committee noted that corporations can effectively strike against the government by just withholding production if they aren't happy with the terms. And let's be real, the government is in no practical position to just seize and operate massive, complex industries on its own. To top it off, the wartime control agencies are usually staffed by guys pulled straight from private industry, so they're naturally pretty sympathetic to the corporate perspective. This leads us right into Section 4, the valuation loophole, focusing on what was called the adjusted compensation contract. 6%. Under these proposed wartime contracts, factories were guaranteed a profit margin of exactly 6% per year based on the estimated value of the part of their plant used for government work. Now, the War Department thought this was perfectly fair, but there is a glaring loophole here. 6% sounds totally reasonable, but 6% of what exactly? This contract basically creates a massive incentive for corporations to wildly overvalue their own plants. This direct exchange from the hearings is just incredibly revealing. Senator Clark asks the obvious, burning question, "How are you going to find value, Colonel?" And the War Department representative admits that it would basically have to be a hurriedly negotiated sum. There are no strict, standardized metrics being applied here. Actually, scratch that. It's more like a blindfolded guessing game played under the extreme pressure of war. And if you're wondering just how impossible that hurried guessing game really is, the committee contrasted this wartime rush with peacetime reality.
Check this out. The Interstate Commerce Commission, a body highly experienced in doing this kind of math, spent 13 years and $27 million just trying to determine the value of railroads during peacetime. So expecting to accurately value entirely different industrial plants literally overnight during a war, it's practically impossible.
To put this seller's market concept into perspective, consider this historical dispute over copper mines. The copper companies claimed their valuation was around $1.45 billion. The government looked at it and evaluated it at just $323 million. That is a difference of over $1 billion. When valuation is based on hasty wartime negotiations, the government's almost definitely going to end up paying that 6% profit on highly inflated billion-dollar guesses.
And to make matters worse, the contracts were incredibly vague about what even counted as legitimate costs. Because the government guaranteed to pay the base costs, plus that 6% profit, every questionable expense just got passed straight to the taxpayer. The committee found the government could end up footing the bill for royalties paid to foreign corporations, massive executive bonuses, and even the legal costs of companies making claims against the government itself.
Now, let's pivot to Section 5, drafting the workforce, and the iron-fisted control over labor. So, we've just seen how capital gets treated with careful negotiations and guaranteed profits. But when we look at Senate Bill 1721, the report takes a very stark turn regarding the American worker. This bill essentially proposed putting the entire male population of the nation under strict military control. And unlike the flexible, friendly negotiations offered to factory owners, the rules proposed for everyday laborers completely remove their right to refuse employment under conditions they didn't like. The committee actually outlined a remarkably grim step-by-step pipeline for any worker who pushed back. Let's say an industrial worker decided to strike for higher wages or just failed to work continuously exactly where the government told them to. First, they would immediately lose their military deferment. Next, they could be drafted straight into active military service. Or worse, the government could literally cut off their access to food, fuel, and the basic necessities of life. The testimony covering this mobilization plan indicated to the committee that the rules boiled down to an absolutely uncompromising ultimatum for labor: work, fight, or starve. The contrast here is just jarring. While capital retains its leverage and ensures its profits, the everyday laborer is stripped of their bargaining power completely. Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, the price of victory. Dictatorship or democracy? The committee issued a really profound warning based on all of this. They concluded that when you look at the strict drafting of manpower and the absolute control over labor, the ultimate price of a future war might be an actual operating dictatorship under military control right here at home. Just to summarize the chilling administrative realities the committee uncovered, these plans opened the door to strict censorship of the press. They fixed wages for workers but couldn't successfully limit the prices of goods or the profits of owners. They openly planned to use the military draft as a weapon to break strikes. The committee bluntly stated that it is simply impossible to put capital on a level playing field with men drafted for frontline service. And maybe scariest of all, these intense military controls over civilian life could legally continue for up to 6 months after the president declared the emergency over. The Senate committee totally tore away the myth of a smoothly run, economically fair war effort. They left Congress and really all of us with a haunting reality check. If the absolute only way to effectively wage a modern war is to sacrifice economic fairness, draft the labor force under the literal threat of starvation, and grant near-dictatorial powers to the military, are Americans actually willing to pay that price? It's a heavy question, and one that echoes just as loudly today. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history behind the headlines.